During the First World War, the Imperial Russian government expelled 200,000 Jews from Lithuania and Latvia on spurious accusations of spying for Germany. Despite their efforts, the expulsion process was spotty and haphazard, so a large number of Jews remained in the area as it fell. Under occupation, hunger and disease became widespread, and the population was subjected to forced labor. Even so, the Jews were treated more equitably by their German occupiers than their own government. Following Russia's twin revolutions and the 1918 Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the German Empire established 4 client kingdoms in the occupied Baltics, and though the monarchy didn't really take, the idea of independence did. Just 8 months after the creation of the client kingdoms, the German Empire collapsed, the Soviets renounced Brest-Litovsk and began advancing west, and the Baltic provisional governments got to work. Estonia's War of Independence was the first to begin and the first to end. With support from the British, Estonia successfully fought off the Soviets and rogue remnants of the German army and was the first Baltic state to make peace. Latvia declared independence on the 18th of November and began pushing back against the Soviets, but in April 1919, the region of Courland was seized by an alliance of remnant German and Russian monarchists known as the Bermontians. They intended to reconquer all the Baltic states as part of a restored Russian Empire, but the Latvian government defeated them by the end of the year. The struggle against the Soviets was effectively already over, and in August 1920, Moscow recognized Latvian independence. Under the Russians, relations between Jews and ethnic Lithuanians had been sparse and often contentious, but the struggle for independence created a new solidarity between them, often appealing to the Jewish diaspora in the West for financial support in the fight against Poland and the Soviets, though this didn't prevent Lithuanian soldiers from occasionally looting and extorting Jewish civilians near the lines of battle. In December 1918, a provisional government known as the Taryba formed, which included 3 Jewish politicians. In January, the Taryba declared full political equality for all minorities as well as political autonomy for Jews and Belarusians, with a dedicated ministry for Jewish affairs. That same January, Vilnius was captured by the Soviets, before falling under Polish control 4 months later. Vilnius had been Lithuania's historic capital and largest city. It was also home to an enormous Jewish population and was the historic center of Yiddish literature. But despite losing the capital, by July 1919, the Allies had become convinced that an independent Lithuania was here to stay. Meanwhile, on the front lines, Poland began a major offensive eastward in an effort to recapture the territories of the early modern Polish kingdom. This didn't end the Lithuanian-Soviet conflict, but it did result in an effective truce, as both countries focused on the Polish threat. A year later, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive overrunning the Polish front, making peace with Lithuania and allowing Lithuanian forces to retake Vilnius. But it wasn't to last. In August, the Poles rebounded, and in October they retook the city. In March 1921, the Soviet-Polish peace treaty effectively recognized Polish rule over the city, but Lithuania never agreed to this. Officially, Vilnius remained the official capital, with Kaunas as merely a temporary seat of government. For the time being, the two countries would remain enemies. With independence secured, the Jewish members of the Taryba directed their focus to Jewish autonomy. Back in the 1890s, an idea began to gain traction that, as Eastern Europe democratized, local Jewish populations should pursue a political arrangement whereby, in addition to the rights of citizenship, they should also enjoy administrative autonomy to provide education, cultural programs, and government services in the local Jewish language, similar to the rights afforded by Canada today to French speakers living outside of Quebec. In Lithuania, as in most of Eastern Europe, that language was Yiddish. And true to that vision, the Paris Declaration of August 1919 promised Lithuanian Jews all of the aforementioned linguistic rights, as well as a community council to oversee their implementation. Up to this point, the most popular autonomous movement by far had been the General Jewish Labor Bund, which combined autonomism with a fairly hardline form of socialism and a general hostility towards Zionism. The Bund was actually founded in Vilnius, but despite the title of this video, they ended up not playing a significant role in the Lithuanian Republic. See, Bundism had actually been attempted before, in the very short-lived Ukrainian People's Republic. But when the Ukrainian state collapsed, the Bund defected to the Soviets and merged with the Communist Party. Because of this association, the Bund in Lithuania was banned. Instead, the project of autonomy fell to a collection of tiny, disparate Jewish parties which merged to form the Democratic Jewish Union. So I'm sorry for the clickbait title, I just couldn't resist the pun. With the original Minister for Jewish Affairs staying behind in his native Vilnius, the vacancy was filled by Max Soloveitchik, who managed to organize elections for the promised Community Council even in the midst of war. What followed was a long series of disappointments. In 1920, the ZDS won only 6 out of the 112 seats in the Constituent Assembly. They'd expected to win at least twice that many. Only then did Soloveitchik realize just how many of their potential voters had fled or been expelled during the World War and the War of Independence. According to a census taken 3 years later, the Republic of Lithuania had a total Jewish population of 155,280. Though they were still the country's largest minority group, they were a shadow of what they'd been before the wars, especially without Vilnius. But it was partly because of Vilnius that the government in Kaunas was so enthusiastic about Jewish autonomy. Lithuanian sympathy was still extremely high among that city's Jewish population, to the point of boycotting a Polish referendum on annexation. By demonstrating a commitment to their Jewish, Lithuanian, and Belarusian subjects on both sides of the contested border, Kaunas hoped that the League of Nations might be moved to contest that referendum and intervene on their behalf. Accordingly, the Ministry for Jewish Affairs got actual teeth. Between 1920 and 1922, a series of new laws empowered Soloveitchik to set and collect special taxes for the Jewish community and to assist the Ministry of Education in the standardization of Yiddish language schools. But at this point, the ZDS hit a roadblock. The election of 1920 had gone surprisingly well for conservative, strongly Catholic parties that still participated in coalitions with the ZDS, but drew the line at recognizing the Community Council or enshrining autonomy in the Constitution. Their opposition caused such a headache that Soloveitchik resigned from the government in August 1922 and departed the country soon after. As a compromise, the final version of the Constitution guaranteed minority language rights in education and culture and empowered the Seimas to establish minority councils in the future, but there was no pretense that this would actually happen. With the promise of Jewish autonomy broken, most Jewish voters abandoned the ZDS, which split into Zionist and non-Zionist factions and fared disastrously in the 1922 election. Adding insult to injury, the government began arguing that minority language rights somehow didn't apply to private businesses, inspiring fascist thugs to march through the streets of Kaunas in February 1923, defacing storefronts with non-Lithuanian signage. The ruling government's response was unsurprisingly tepid. Instead, the greatest condemnation came from ceremonial president Antanas Smetona. Despite coming from the political right himself, rightists in the Seimas derided Smetona as King of the Jews, while their party newspapers accused the Jewish population of everything from causing budget deficits to spying for Poland. In response to this growing bigotry, the Jewish, German, Russian, and Belarusian parties merged to form the United Minorities, but it was no use. The 1923 election gave the Conservative Bloc an outright majority, which they used to blackball Jewish deputies from parliamentary committees, abolish the Ministry for Jewish Affairs, blame the Jewish population alone for the widespread problem of tax evasion, and unconstitutionally crack down on minority language rights in government and education. The anti-Semitic movement really showed its nature in 1924, when the Seimas passed a law restricting Jewish citizens' rights to work on Sundays and Christian holidays. Because most Jews didn't work on Saturdays, Jewish deputies in the Seimas correctly identified this as an effort by Catholic nationalists to keep the Jewish population poor by shortening their work week. Another deputy, a Catholic priest and strident clericalist, proclaimed that it was a necessary measure to liberate Kaunas from the Jewish bloodsuckers. The same day, they even honored the rioters of 1923 by banning minority languages from commercial signage. Perhaps the situation wouldn't have been as dire if the crown jewels of Lithuanian Jewish culture had remained part of Lithuania. In 1921, when the Soviet Union launched a program to standardize Yiddish and establish it as official minority language, they did so from Minsk. And in 1925, when the Institute for Jewish Research was created as an academy for Yiddish outside the Soviet Union, its headquarters were in Vilnius. On the other hand, the Vilnius question may have kept things from reaching this point sooner. Either way, Lithuania's Jews ended up with the worst of both worlds. This video is brought to you in part by OmniAtlas, specifically the excellent political maps. I've been working behind the scenes with OmniAtlas since 2013, twice as long as I've been working on this channel, and there's a reason. OmniAtlas doesn't just show you official boundaries, but does its very best to display political control on the ground at any given date. My videos wouldn't be complete without access to their maps and map templates, so do yourself a favor and check them out through the link in the description below. According to the census of 1920, Latvia had a total Jewish population of 79,644, about 5% of the overall population. As in Lithuania, this was less than half of what it had been before the First World War. A growing share of Jews lived in the capital Riga, though there was also a large population in Daugavpils and even 2 majority Jewish villages. In December 1919, the provisional government passed a law guaranteeing that towns and villages with more than 30 children speaking a minority language would have the right to elementary education in that language, though Jewish leaders fought constantly over whether their elementary schools should teach in Yiddish, Hebrew, or German. Though the school law was meant as the first step towards comprehensive autonomy, any attempts to deliver on that promise were shot down in the Constitutional Assembly. By the end of the war, Labor Minister Paul Mintz was the last remaining Jewish Counselor of State, and he left office less than a year later. Foreign Minister and sometime Prime Minister Siegfried Smerovitz had a Jewish father, but that was it. The most dramatic moment in Latvian Jewish politics was probably the trial of Abraham Braun, the leader of Latvia's Jewish Bund. Braun was a radical even by Bundist standards. In his younger days, he'd led terrorist activities against the Russian government. As a wanted man, he'd gone on to spend many years in exile, and during the Russian Civil War, he was one of the many Bundist leaders who initially sided against the Bolsheviks before joining their ranks in the fight against the reactionary whites. So when he returned home in June 1921, he was immediately arrested for treason, convicted, and sentenced to death. Of course, the situation was a little more complicated. While the Bund in Ukraine had defected to the Red Army, they only did so after the downfall of their Menshevik and Ukrainian nationalist allies, and they continued to implement Bundist principles under Lenin through the Jewish Commissariat, or Evcom. They were particularly active in Belarus, where Yiddish became an official language and where Braun was most active. While he'd spoken out against counter-revolutionary activity, he was still a strong critic of the communists, so the allegation that he was a communist vanguard rang hollow. Luckily, he had a lot of people willing to speak up for him. The Bund in Latvia was an autonomous bloc within the Latvian Social Democratic Party, who weren't part of the government but were still the biggest party in the Constitutional Assembly and were affiliated with the anti-communist Socialist International. Plus, Latvia had made peace with the Soviets. So with help from the Socialist International, Braun's conviction was dismissed, though leadership of the bloc soon passed to physician Noah Meisel, who led the party to a single-seat victory in the elections of 1922. In every election between 1920 and 1931, over 90% of Jewish voters supported Jewish interest parties. In addition to the Bund, Max Lazarsson Tzer Etzion served as the Latvian counterpart to Mapai in Palestine. Tzer Etzion disagreed with the Bund on Zionism, but this wasn't a particularly salient issue, so both parties generally caucused with the Social Democrats. But neither of them were as popular as the modern Orthodox Mizrahi and the ultra-Orthodox Agudas Yisrael. So you might assume that most Latvian Jews were quite conservative, and it's probably true that the median Latvian Jewish voter was somewhat to the right of his counterpart in most other countries, but the success of Mizrahi and Agudas rested mainly on the popularity of their leaders. Mordechai Nerok came from a long line of rabbis. His brother Aaron was the chief rabbi of Liepaja and often served alongside him in the Saema. Under the Russians, Korlin's status within the Pale of Settlement had been somewhat ambiguous, so whenever the Russian government tried messing with the Jewish population there, Nerok was their spokesman, gaining particular fame in 1915 when he spoke out against the wartime deportations. Though his party was religiously and fiscally conservative, he tended to align himself with the center and left due to their support for religious and ethnic pluralism. Mordechai Dubin was a lumber dealer, not a rabbi, but he was the self-appointed political leader of the Hasidic movement Chabad, and like Nerok, he was well known for assisting his fellow Jews regardless of their religious or political leanings. He enjoyed a monopoly on the ultra-Orthodox vote, and used it to engage in some unusual political maneuvers. Mainly affiliated with the center-right Farmers Union, Dubin went out of his way to support right-wing coalitions, arguing that while the socialists would always support equality for the Jewish population, the right wing needed to have its anti-Semitic elements kept in check by people like him. Debates between the four parties were lively and aggressive, but when it came to issues affecting the Jewish population, they could get a lot done. As early as 1918, they coordinated reconstruction efforts for villages, schools, and hospitals destroyed in the war. And in the Saeima, they fought to secure a right of return for Jews who'd fled Latvia during the war. The provisional government had given amnesty to refugees, but due to some ambiguous wording, Jews who'd lived outside the Pale of Settlement weren't included in the imperial registers used to readmit them. Only in 1927, under a brief left-wing government, was the law changed. And while minority politicians weren't exactly known for their foreign policy achievements, Dubin actually got one. In 1927, he helped negotiate for the Soviet Union to release Chabad leader Yosef Yitzhak Schneerson from prison in favor of exile in Riga. But that was about as far as the Jewish parties ever got. In 1928, that left-wing government was toppled in favor of a right-wing coalition that sought to undo the previous year of legislation. They didn't repeal the refugee law, but they did repeal a major trade agreement with the Soviet Union, imposed tariffs to help Riga industrialists create local monopolies, helped large landowners secure monopolies on agricultural goods, and normalized ethnic Latvian chauvinism in the Saeima, all of which disproportionately impacted the Jewish population. That wasn't a coincidence. When Estonia held its first census in 1922, Jews numbered just 4,566. Less than 0.5% of the national population. Estonia had never been part of the Pale of Settlement, so most of the country's Jews were the descendants of so-called useful Jews who'd obtained permission from the Imperial Russian government to live outside the Pale, of which there just weren't that many. And yet, they showed Latvia and Lithuania how it was done. On the 12th of February 1925, Estonia's parliament, the Riigikogu, passed a law granting full linguistic autonomy in the areas of education and culture to all minority groups numbering more than 3,000. In addition to having primary and secondary schools teaching in both Hebrew and Yiddish, Jewish voters were empowered to elect a 27-member cultural council which could impose minority taxes to build new schools, libraries, and other institutions for the purpose. Let me be clear, the Jewish population never lobbied for this. There were no Jewish deputies in the Riigikogu. Estonia, by far the most ethnically homogeneous of the Baltic countries, just decided to do it. At this time, about half the Jewish population lived in either the capital Tallinn or the second largest city, Tartu. It may seem unlikely that two Jewish communities with populations comparable to a medium-sized high school would be able to build any Jewish institutions beyond maybe a synagogue, but they did. Within 3 years, Tallinn was home to at least 13 Jewish institutions, while the University of Tartu began offering classes in Jewish history and philosophy. Estonia's Jewish community was 100 years old. Its founding generation mostly comprised Jewish men who'd been kidnapped as children and tortured by the Russian government, forced into military service for a sizable percentage of their lives, and then permitted to live far away from their families, in the expectation that they would give in to despair, abandon their native language, and adopt Christianity. That didn't happen, and when Estonia became independent, they were treated as equals and got what their neighbors to the south never could. They won. You may have noticed a weird enclave on the border between Lithuania and Germany. This was Memelland, comprising the mostly German city of Memel and the mostly Lithuanian countryside, who referred to the city as Klaipėda. With the region's status unresolved even after the Treaty of Versailles, it remained a free territory under French administration. But in 1923, with France distracted by the Ruhr crisis in Germany, Lithuanian militias seized power and annexed the territory for Kaunas. The effect on Lithuanian politics probably wasn't what its conservative government had hoped for. In addition to boosting the German minority, Memel also helped fuel a left-wing resurgence in the 1926 election. The left formed a majority coalition with the German, Jewish, and Polish parties and immediately got to work freeing political prisoners, ending restrictions on the press imposed by the previous government, weakening the power of the military, allowing Jewish deputies back into parliamentary committees, and finally honoring the promise of comprehensive Jewish autonomy. Lithuania's sudden turn towards normalized democracy lasted just over 6 months. Convinced that these reforms were the first step toward a communist revolution, the armed forces launched a coup against the Seimas and restored the recently defeated Smetona to the presidency. The socialists and ethnic minorities in the Seimas declared a vote of no confidence in order to force new elections, but Smetona simply refused to hold them, turning himself from a mostly ceremonial president into a dictator aligned with the fascist LTS. Lithuania wouldn't hold another free election until 1990. Instead of fulfilling the earlier government's commitment to Jewish autonomy, Smetona's regime embarked on a course that author Masha Greenbaum later called Lithuanization. There wasn't an immediate crackdown on minority languages, but the government did mandate the use of Lithuanian for certain school subjects, shut down a few Yiddish language schools, and eventually closed the Jewish Teachers College, which all but guaranteed the phasing out of Yiddish education. When Jewish politicians and community leaders tried to raise awareness of incompetence or corruption in government, Smetona's partners accused the Jews of causing these problems, even proposing a ban on Jewish property ownership and encouraging police to ignore street violence targeting Jews. Smetona, who'd once been ridiculed by his allies for speaking out against anti-Semitism, was now happy to repeat their accusations, denouncing his Jewish subjects as both capitalist swindlers and communist agitators, while hoping that their disagreeableness would soon sabotage the Polish state and enable him to take Vilnius. To the north, democratic forms of government continued for a few more years, but the onset of the Great Depression seriously destabilized them, with constant changes in government. In May 1934, Latvian Prime Minister Karlis Ulmanis attempted to restore order by leading his minority government in a coup against the rest of the Saeima, later establishing himself as both president and prime minister. Socialist and Zionist parties were banned, all traces of Jewish autonomy were dissolved, and Jewish party leaders were briefly imprisoned in the Liepaja concentration camp. Noah Meisel and Rabbi Nurok were later released and forcibly retired from politics. Tzer Etzion's members were released on the condition that they emigrate to Palestine. In recognition of his loyalty to the ruling party, Mordechai Dubin was given full political authority over the Jewish population, overseeing the dismantling of the free Yiddish-speaking press. In the meantime, a new permit system imposed massive restrictions on Jewish rights to participate in the economy or employ non-Jewish workers. In 1936, London's Jewish Chronicle proclaimed, "Estonia is the only country in Eastern Europe where neither the government nor the people practice any discrimination against Jews and where Jews are left in peace. The cultural autonomy granted to Estonian Jews 10 years ago still holds good, and Jews are allowed to lead a free and unmolested life and fashion it in accord with their national and cultural principles." This was all the more impressive because, like Latvia, Estonia had been a dictatorship since 1934. As in Latvia, the Great Depression had destabilized the government, but it had also encouraged the creeping influence of fascism. The Rikikoku banned Nazism in 1933, but the following year's municipal elections resulted in sweeping victories for the fascist but not anti-Semitic VAPS movement, led by General Andres Larka. To prevent a fascist takeover, Prime Minister Konstantin Pats led his own coup against the VAPS movement and established a temporary dictatorship. Ever the exception, Estonia's dictatorship really was temporary. In 1938, Pats and his allies issued a new constitution and began the process of transitioning back to democracy. But it was too late. On the 20th of March 1939, Nazi Germany presented Lithuania with an ultimatum to cede Memel back to them. By this time, the Baltics had formed a diplomatic and military alliance, but in practice it was no match for any of their neighbors. The Lithuanians agreed to give up Memel. It was the beginning of the end. On the 23rd of August, representatives of Nazi Germany met in secret with their Soviet counterparts in Moscow to craft what's now known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. By late 1935, it was clear to most of the world that a Second World War was coming, but it wasn't obvious how soon or how much of the world would be involved. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact answered these questions. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to invade and partition Poland. To sweeten the deal, the Soviets would have free rein to establish puppet states in Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. Without Poland in the way, Lithuania would at last receive Vilnius while falling under Germany's sphere of influence, but this was later amended to place it under Soviet dominance. The reasons for the pact are a little confusing, so bear with me. Germany and the Soviet Union were extreme ideological opposites, and over the previous 3 years they'd supported opposing sides in the Spanish Civil War. The Nazis wanted to invade Poland for all the reasons Nazis usually want land, but they also didn't want to repeat the German Empire's mistake of fighting a two-front war, which meant keeping the Soviet Union from allying with Britain and France when those countries came to Poland's defense. On the other hand, Soviet Supreme Leader Joseph Stalin wanted to reclaim as many of the lost territories of the Russian Empire as he possibly could, but he was also preoccupied with a massive purge of real and perceived opponents within the Communist Party, including any army general who was competent enough to pose a political threat. He understood that war with Germany was inevitable, but he needed time to rebuild the military, and he believed that this pact would buy him 5 or 6 years. The war began 9 days later, and over the next 2 months, Moscow pressured the Baltic states into hosting Soviet military bases, from which they then occupied the Baltics and hosted sham elections in which only the communists could run. The newly elected governments voted for annexation, and the Baltic states were no more. This was the world in August 1940. For most of the Jews of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, this really would be the end. But that's beyond the scope of this video. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, David Ben Yosef, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Dr. Chike, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Saul Cohn, Milk and Honey, David Safarian, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.